Welcome, everybody, to the Utah Stories Show. My name is Rich Markosian. On the program today is Joell Janetski. He was a professor at BYU in archaeology for 30 years. He's written several books about the indigenous tribes of Utah, mostly focusing on the Fremont Indians. Our conversation was wide-ranging, but what I found incredibly fascinating was talking about the diet of sedentary indigenous people compared to hunters and gatherers, and how in Utah we had Indians, Native Americans who were displaced, sedentary tribes, the Fremont Indians that we refer to them as, by the Ute Indians. How was it that happened? How was it that the Utes basically came into this area and the Fremont Indians, who were sedentary, planted crops, had more established culture and civilization, were replaced by the Ute Indians, who had adopted the horses, who had more of a warrior mentality type civilization? So we'll get into that. Without further ado, my conversation with Joell Janetski. We have on the program today a professor who's one of the foremost experts into the Fremont Indians, the Indians who were around before the Ute Indians, and really the indigenous people of Utah. And we're going to be talking about the how the picture has emerged in more recent years due to the recent archaeological finds they've discovered. And Professor Joell Janetski is going to be with us. He's retired from BYU. He lives in Washington. He's coming through with us on a Zoom meeting. It's the first time we've ever done this before. I'm really excited about it because we can take your questions. If you have questions, we'll be over on YouTube, and we can also see live audio and video from him. So it's going to be awesome because this is a topic that's really been misunderstood by a lot of people. I really feel like a lot of schools don't teach accurate history in terms of really what the Native American tribes were like, what they were all about, what was going on during sort of the development of Europe when as Europe was developing, how was North America developing? That's really what we want to answer in this really interesting interview. So we will get right into it. So to introduce Professor Joell Janetski, he was professor at BYU. He's written numerous books and articles about the Native Americans who lived in the Great Basin region, as well as the Intermountain West. Dr. Janatsky has specifically studied extensively the Fremont Indians, who I find personally very fascinating, and his colleague at the University of Alberta will both be coming out with a new book soon of their findings. They've been studying the far north end of the Great Salt Lake, and they found some amazing things about the Fremont Indians. So, Dr. Janatsky, welcome to the podcast.
Glad to be here.
All right. Just by way of introduction, how long did you teach archaeology and paleontology at BYU?
Okay, first, I did not teach paleontology. That's the realm of dinosaurs.
Oh, just archaeology.
And no people are involved with paleontology other than the scientists who study the very, very distant past, typically. Well, I taught at BYU for about 28 years. And my colleague and I at the University of Alberta have been studying the post-Fremont era, for the most part, a period that we refer to as the Promontory because of the fact that the sites where much of this work has been done is in the Promontory Mountains on the north shore of the Great Salt Lake.
And Promontory Point is where the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. So it's just right around that area, within an island of the Great Salt Lake, or just on the shore, or where specifically were you guys looking at?
Many of these sites are on the peninsula. That's called Promontory Peninsula, and there are other sites that are to the east that have Promontory era sites, as well as down the Wasatch Front as far south as Utah Valley.
So one of your major findings was you found some moccasins that were an import from Canada. Now, how moccasins obviously break down over time. Did you guys find these in a cave? How did you come about them?
Right. These moccasins are distinctive from the moccasins that were made by the Fremont. That's one of the reasons that the early researchers, a guy named Julian Stewart, who was at the University of Utah in the 1930s, he speculated that the people who occupied the cave and wore those moccasins were, in fact, from northern Canada.
So there was a big northern migration. And I want to get back to that a little bit later. But what I'm really looking to do in this episode is kind of trace the history of the Native American people in the same kind of time period when we generally study Western European history. So let's get started with what we know as the oldest indigenous people who inhabited North America specifically. What I know that's changed over time. There used to be the Clovis first theory, but that was the idea that indigenous people were arriving right after the end of the Ice Age, but that's changed with more recent findings. Who and what time did the oldest people start coming to North America?
Well, current evidence suggests that the Clovis first model is softening somewhat because a number of sites have been located that are earlier than that, not only in North America, but also South America. When I say earlier than that, I mean earlier than 10, 11,000 years ago. So there's sites up in Alaska and even in the north western Great Basin that date prior to 11,000 years ago now.
So
but
is
we're
that
still
12,000, 13,000? How long ago?
Yeah, I think the earliest dates are around 14 from some caves in Oregon.
And what sort of remains are they going by that they're able to date it back that far?
Well, it then depends on the kind of site, but those in Oregon are from dry caves, and so there are some perishables that are preserved. In Alaska, they're dating charcoal and bone. South America, similar kinds of things are being dated because those are open sites.
Got it. And so if we go back 14,000 years ago, that's when indigenous people were still hunting megafauna such as mastodons, woolly mammoths, just giant predator animals. Is that correct?
Well,
Some of those were predators, some of them are herbivores, but
yeah, that's a common notion about ancient peoples here in the North America, that they were in fact hunters of big game, that is now extinct megafauna. But actually they hunted everything that was available to them that were just like hunter-gatherers in more recent times. And they even plant remains were important as well. And we know that because of a cave that I actually worked in, not a cave, but a rock shelter down in southern Utah. And a colleague of mine from the Museum of Natural History there at the University of Utah found evidence of using wild potatoes as well as at about 10,000 years ago. So we know they were harvesting plants of various kinds, and not domesticated plants, wild plants. And people would have always used and harvested wild plants. But of course, they did hunt mastodon, they did hunt mammoths, and they did hunt other now extinct fauna that inhabited the region at the end of the Pleistocene.
And so to move forward in time, when did we start seeing domesticated crops show up in the peoples of North America?
Well, it's kind of restricted to Utah. In Utah, in the eastern Great Basin, we see corn arriving at about the time of Christ and shortly thereafter. There are a number of sites now that have been found, especially a site called Cowboy Cave, also the Elsinore Burial, which is an open site just south of Richfield. Corn there dates to just after the time of Christ. But we don't really see what we call farming societies with all the accoutrements of farming societies for a couple of centuries after that. The accoutrements of farming societies include storage facilities to store their crops, as well as usually pottery comes in about that time. And about that time, we also see the bow and arrow, although that's probably not related to farming. It's a separate development that probably came from the north.
So when you say accoutrements, you mean the pottery that they would use to store the grains in,
That's right.
that sort of thing. And so what when did you start seeing the storage of grains and true farming societies show up?
I would say about 400 AD. There's a really important site just north of Vernal called the Steinecker Gap site, where archaeologists found deeply buried bell-shaped pits with burials and evidence of corn farming, even irrigation ditches. These date to 2 to 300 AD, somewhere in that area.
So about the time Christianity began to flourish in Europe, they in North America they just were starting to domesticate crops and store crops. And how widespread was that practice? Were was it generally the whole Great Basin area where they started using doing farming on a massive scale, or was it more limited to perhaps southern Utah, northern Arizona, that area?
Well, I'm talking about the Eastern Great Basin specifically. So farming and all the accoutrements of farming, which includes in some areas more complex societies, developed much earlier to the south in Mexico and in South America.
Yeah, the
So I'm
Aztec
restricting these
Empire
comments.
occurred.
I'm just talking about the Eastern Great Basin in
Yeah,
Utah.
but it is. Does it seem pretty clear that that practice was a result of people or the technology moving from South America to North America, from the Aztec Empire into North America?
Well, current evidence suggests that corn was probably domesticated in Mexico. So it diffused either by people or through the transmission of ideas, and the corn itself in bags of seed corn or such diffused northward into North America. And this probably was happening well before the time of Christ, 1 to 2000 BC. That's some of the earliest dates on corn that we have in Arizona, especially.
So when you talk about the Fremont people, what time period did they exist in, and what were their defining characteristics?
The time period that we're talking about in the Eastern Great Basin and the Colorado Plateau is about between 2 to 300 AD to about 1300 AD. And the characteristics are, as we talked about, farming was here. Not everybody was intensively farming, but the largest villages, which consisted mostly of pit houses in both above ground and in sheltered places and cliff faces and such, storage facilities for corn and other things. Along with these pit house villages, you also find a lot of pottery. That's one of the hallmarks of the Fremont, is that its pottery became widespread, and it's pretty sophisticated pottery. But one of the other hallmarks of the Fremont is really an art style, and that's expressed in rock art. This is especially visible on the Colorado Plateau and the Vernal area, and down in southern and to the south of that, as well as in these clay figurines that were made, which in some cases are pretty elaborated. We also see the importance of trade, because we see a lot of things brought into the area that had not been here before, especially marine shells such as Lalivela and also turquoise. These are important characteristics of the Fremont.
And they were crafting a different style of moccasin and clothing than the what the Ute Indians and the Numic-speaking tribes were. Is that how you were able to tell the difference, or what are the primary ways you're able to tell the differences between the Fremont and their and the Numic-speaking tribes who came after him?
Okay, first of all, the Fremont, as I said, had a distinctive art style. as was expressed in rock art and in ceramics, the way they made pottery. As we shift away from farming around 1300 AD, we find that the ceramics changed quite dramatically. It's not quite as well made. At least it was, the pots tend to be larger, thicker, cruder, or poorly fired. You don't get painted pottery. You don't get pottery with handles. You don't get pottery with much impression on the surface, like corrugations. Those are things that are very common to the south as well with the Anasazi. Other things change also, although they're probably not quite as important, but arrow points, for example, the shape of them changes somewhat. But also important, in addition to the moccasins, is basketry. The Fremont made basketry in a particular way. And after the Fremont period, after about 1300, it changes. So you get stacked coiled basketry as opposed to, you can get kind of complex here, but one rod and a bundle style coiled basketry, and that sort of thing. Moccasins with the Fremont tended to be really different, and they had oftentimes had fur on the exterior. These are moccasins that were found down in the Capitol Reef area back in the 30s. And they had, when they made the moccasins, they skinned the lower leg of the animal, whether deer or mountain sheep, and they left the dew claws on there. So the dew claws were on the soles of the moccasins. The moccasins that we find later with what I call the Promontory period, they did not have that. They are much more like the moccasins found to the north, and they have what's called a pucker toe. It's kind of anyway, it's quite different. Not only that, we find porcupine quills included in the decoration of the moccasins, which didn't exist with the Fremont. Quite a few differences. And then there's another change. Those moccasins, the Promontory moccasins, are quite different from the Ute moccasins, which do not have a puckered toe. So without seeing illustrations of these things.
No, we'll have to find the images and show them, because that sounds really fascinating. So the Fremont moccasins before the later period had the claws still sticking out, and I'm sure it was a artistic and stylistic attribute that they decided to include in the moccasin, and that was probably more difficult to make. Do you assume that?
I don't know that it was more difficult to make. I never made any moccasins.
Yeah, I guess it would be hard to, but I
But
guess
it's unusual. And the fact that they're furred, that is, they have the hair of the animal on the exterior. Many of the Promontory moccasins actually had hair, like buffalo hair, stuffed inside, probably to keep feet warm. If you move to the south at the same time period as the Fremont lived here in Utah, to the south, people didn't make moccasins much. They made sandals. So there are all these little differences regionally. Makes it really fun to study this kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So what I want to ask you about next is, so at about the height of the Renaissance in Europe, about 1400, there was the beginning of a dramatic change in North America, where the Fremont people migrated left, or something happened to them. As you see the pottery change over from this thin, very elaborate pottery to this cruder form, what other evidence is there that you have that suggests there were major cultural changes, or perhaps, as evidence suggests, that there were big changes in the Great Basin, the eastern Great Basin region, from what you found?
Well, probably the most important change is the slow abandonment of farming. And as farming changed, the location of villages changed, because people didn't need to locate where farming was possible so much. And that's illustrated pretty well in settlement patterns along the eastern Great Basin, and both in Salt Lake valleys and to the north, as well as to the south in Utah Valley. During the Fremont period, people tended to build their houses and such in places where they could farm, like at the mouths of canyons where there's a nice alluvial sediment that would be rich and fertile for the growing of corn. But after that, people tended to live right around the edges of the marshes in those valleys that I just mentioned. So they could be closer to the lacustal resources that are available there, especially fish and muskrats and waterfowl and all the plants that are available in marshes. And we can see this in both areas. Around the edge of the Great Salt Lake, this happened. That is, settlements kind of moved down in elevation somewhat. And so the reason for that is the abandonment of farming. And we do think that a kind of double whammy occurred at about 1300 AD or so. Actually, maybe a bit earlier in the Great Salt Lake Valley, between 1150 and about 1200, there's a shift in summer moisture. And we don't have the summer monsoons that used to occur in that area after about 1150. And so farming wasn't as viable because they relied heavily on summer moisture. And at the same time, people, these are the ancestors that we refer to as the Promontory, probably Proto-Apacheans or Athabascan speakers, began to move southward. And we also have the people, the ancestors of the Utes and Paiutes that were coming somewhat to the east from the south and west. So as the farmers began to feel those pressures, both climatic and perhaps demographic, they shifted southward. And we believe that the Fremont are the ancestors of some of the modern Puebloan peoples of the American Southwest. And eventually farming goes away completely. So by 1400 or so AD, in these valleys along the Wasatch Front, no more farming. It's the same as the case pretty much on the Colorado Plateau, although some lingering evidence of farming has been found, but for the most part, farming is gone by 1400 AD.
So to summarize, in about over a 100-year period or 5 generations, you went from primarily farming to almost no farming at all. Is that right?
That's correct. The farming was widely available. Not everybody farmed, we don't think. We have some sites that are in places where you could not have farmed. I excavated a site up on Fish Lake Plateau at 9,000 feet. They were not farming there. They were probably just there in the summertime. And there are Fremont era sites to the west, out in the sand dunes along the edges of the Great Salt Lake Desert. South of that, the people were not farming there either. But during that era, between about 500 AD and 1300 AD, farming and farm products were widely available
and
to everybody.
So the transition that happened, you can assume that the climate change was the primary factor or the secondary factor, or how big of a factor do you know that was, and how can you tell?
Well, that's a good question. We don't have all the answers. That's why we need to keep doing research. But the current evidence suggests that shifts in climatic pattern was a primary factor in the demise of farming. And you get that information mostly from either tree ring data, which reflects climate patterns because of the width of tree rings, which vary with the available moisture for those trees. Plus, you get good information from pollen cores. And those have been, these are generated by individuals who drive pipes deep into the ground. And so you get a wonderful history of the pollen rain that's occurring all the time. And as different kinds of plants are represented in the pollen profile, we can say that the climate is shifting from drier to wetter conditions. So the combination of those things especially are what tell us about climate change.
That's really interesting. So as far as the climate change we're experiencing right now, this is not something new, that the climate can have severe and dramatic changes over the period of 100 years, and it's happened before, obviously.
climate is always changing. I mean, the most extreme example is the end of the Ice Age.
Yeah.
Although that took a little bit longer. The fact that climate is shifting so quickly is a bit unusual. I'm not a climate scientist, but we do know that, for instance, in the 1500s, right here in the Eastern Great Basin, there was a time called the Little Ice Age, and things got cooler and wetter for a time. And prior to that, there was a climatic anomaly that's referred to as a medieval climatic anomaly, where it was drier. So climate has always been changing, and we're experiencing that now in fairly rapid change. The question is, how much are we affecting that climate change? And chances are we are probably affecting it substantially because of the way we are polluting the atmosphere and the planet in various ways.
Yeah. And so it's hard to understand if one tribe displaces another, but if say the Fremont were displaced by the Ute Indians or the Numic-speaking people, would you have clear evidence if that was a secondary cause or perhaps a primary cause of why they migrated?
That's more difficult. It's difficult to determine the interaction between peoples. The suggestion might be that there was some kind of conflict between the people that we call Fremont. We don't really know what they were called, because that's just a term that archaeologists use to refer to that time period and that strategy that's in place. Mm-hmm. We call the Ute because we have Europeans encountered the Ute when they came here and they had a name for themselves. But the Fremont, that's just a label that we dreamed up based on the Fremont were first defined on the Fremont River down in southern Utah. That's why we call them the Fremont.
But we know they weren't the ancestors of the Utes, don't we?
We don't think they were. Genetic material obtained from both Fremont era human remains as well as post-Fremont era human remains suggest that there is a change in genetic material and change in populations. But that's still ongoing. We're still in the early stages of really studying genetics. And we have to, because of the laws that have been passed recently, we want to pay more attention to the wishes of Native peoples, whose ancestors, whose histories we are studying.
Mm-hmm. So if there were a big conflict or something like that, I guess it would show up in, you might not have any evidence of it at all, but basically what we know about the differences between the Ute Indians or the Numic-speaking people and the Fremont is the Utes didn't even try to farm. They were fierce warriors, and what I learned about them that I didn't learn in school is they're an amazing people. I've gone to some of their powwows. I've met a lot of their tribal leaders, and their history and their culture and their customs are all incredible. Their shamanic traditions are also amazing. But they were more of a warrior type society, and what I learned is as New Mexico became a center for the slave trade, and Spain set up a trading area, the Ute Indians were able to basically attack and plunder other tribes and sell some of the members into slavery, and I'd never heard that in history books before, but is that accurate, the way I've studied it on my own and learned about the Ute Indians? Would you say that's an accurate presentation of the change that happened, the dramatic change in the culture and the society of this area?
Well, there was a time after the Ute got the horse, after about 1800 AD or so, they did raid the Paiutes and exchange Paiutes and children and women to the Spanish down south. But that was a late development. The Ute, for example, in Utah Valley, we know when the Spanish came through here in 1776, they were not warlike. They were not riding horses. They were living in wickiups, etc., around the edges of the lake. and they were fishermen. So those, I wouldn't call them warlike. We didn't find that pattern emerging until, as I said, after they got the horse and began to emulate plains societies who had had the horse for quite a long time and were nomadic hunters of the bison. And because of that strategy, in part, they became more warlike and actually, attacked other groups, etc. We don't see that pattern emerging here for some time. The reason that they got into the more warlike pattern is because of the horse and the influence of the Europeans, especially because the Europeans had things that were very attractive to native peoples, especially metal for weaponry, metal of various kinds, for knives, for hooks, for decorative objects, you name it. But the native people here, the Utes, we're talking about specifically, they did not have metals. And also there were other items that they wanted, for example, glass items, that, for example, trade beads, they were highly sought after and used by the Europeans to entice the native peoples in the West to go out and gather furs, etc., part of the fur trade. Not only that, Europeans had cloth, which the native peoples did not have. So that encouraged this trade of various kinds, including trade in people with Europeans.
So there's really no evidence that they were warlike or that they were they were a warrior society until they encountered Europeans on a sort of massive scale. When Dominguez and Escalante came in and saw the Utes around Utah Lake, they paint a picture that they were basically fishermen and peaceful and not warring with other factions or other tribes. Is that?
Well, you can't assume there wasn't conflict. I mean, if you read the journals carefully, they even talk about conflict with the Shoshone to the north. But it wasn't the kind of conflict that we saw on the plains. And of course, all human societies have conflict one with another for various reasons, usually over some kind of resources. There's wonderful examples of that. If you look, for example, at early Anasazi societies, what we call Anasazi, ancient Puebloan societies, that are termed the basket maker. There are some sites down in southern Utah wherein evidence of a massacre was found dating to around 200 AD or slightly earlier. So there's always been conflict. Mm-hmm. But to call the Ute in Utah Valley, or even any of the Ute in the region prior to about 1800, within the region, I'm talking the Eastern Great Basin, Colorado Plateau, it's probable that Ute societies extended as far east as into Colorado. And those people became familiar with the horse society earlier than those along the Wasatch Front. But eventually that happened. And of course, by the time the Mormons arrived here and displaced the Utes from Utah Valley to the point south, they all moved to the east out in the Ute Basin. And what we see there from a lot of photographs and such are people living in teepees, which makes us think that they were very plains-like, but it was, like I said, a recent development. But that doesn't diminish the respect that we have for Ute people and their ancestors. The fact that these individuals, the Fremont and their successors, were able to sustain a way of life for centuries is really a testament to how adaptable those people were to changing times and to the conditions that existed. You can imagine living as they did without all the resources that we have through winter and summer, right there in Salt Lake or in Utah Valley. You gain a lot of respect for the way those people were able to survive.
Yeah, I can't imagine how brutal a winter in Salt Lake with a teepee would be, especially with children.
We're not talking about teepees. Now remember, prior to the teepees, which was a very recent development.
So what were the Ute Indians living in prior to the teepee?
wiki-ups, what are usually called wiki-ups. And these are
Okay.
structures that were made by bending poles sort of in a half circle. And they would encircle those poles horizontally, and upon that superstructure, they would lay kind of like shingles made out of tule or grasses and that sort of thing, or bark. And they were sometimes excavated a bit into the ground, but for the most part, one of the early travelers, I'm trying to remember his name, through Utah valleys, referred to them as muskrat houses. So if you know what a muskrat house looks like, and expanded by 10 times, that's kind of the houses that they lived in.
And
The
and they
best
were
example
semi-permanent structures?
semi-permanent, but these people were nomadic. They moved up into the mountains in the summer and lived around the edge of the lake probably during the cooler months. The best examples of those kinds of houses are documented photographically in the western Great Basin around Pyramid Lake, etc. So those are the northern Paiute, and they made houses like I'm describing here. We don't have photographs of the houses that the Utes lived in at 1776 because people weren't taking photographs then.
And what I find really fascinating about it is back when I was studying this like 16 years ago, there was no challenging that agrarian societies were better than hunter-gatherer societies. But then more recently, I've started hearing more people argue that perhaps hunter-gatherer societies had greater access to high-value protein. They had a better lifestyle because they could be nomadic. They could follow the warm weather. And that perhaps the whole idea that a gregarian society is superior is not correct. That if they decided to basically adopt the way of life of the Great Plain Indians, which is use horses to get bison and buffalo and to become more effective hunters, could you suggest that the Ute Indians had a superior lifestyle to the Fremont?
The word superior is a
Or
difficult one.
maybe not superior,
But
but better. Just a
let me
better,
say it.
more enjoyable lifestyle.
Well, it was a difficult lifestyle. It is the case that hunter-gatherers generally have a more diverse diet, which is more healthy. If you look at the evidence of early farmers, or even late farmers, as far as that goes, there is a lot more evidence of health problems, of chronic diseases of various kinds, problems with teeth, abscesses, cavities, etc., because they were eating this high corn diet. And that's a lot of carbs, a lot of sugar in corn. And so their teeth went bad very quickly. And they were grinding up that corn on with stone implements, which would then work its way into the cornmeal, which then they would eat. And they would grind down their teeth. And not only that, well, anyway, just in terms of health, the hunter-gatherers were better off than farmers.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that the Utes might have had the option to be farmers, but they just thought, well, why would we be farming if we're such great hunters?
There is evidence that some societies adopted farming and then gave it up after a while, but that was unusual. In fact, in the Eastern Great Basin here in Utah, I'm speaking as though I'm in Utah, it's one of the few places where farming comes and then goes. Like during the period between 1500 and about 1200 AD, farming flourished in this area, but then it goes away. Now, some have said that, well, there was no movement of new peoples, the farmers just gave it up. But regardless, it's a place where farming didn't continue. And so those who came into the area, if we in fact had a migration, and I believe we did, they had the option to be farmers and plant crops, but didn't adopt it for whatever reason. It probably wasn't part of their way of life, and maybe to have learned something that different was difficult. But to the south, with the Paiute, they did adopt farming. And we know that early travelers, such as the Dominguez Escalante party, they did encounter near St. George, they encountered cornfields, etc. So we know that those people down there did start farming.
But I guess there was never evidence that they practiced farming using massive irrigation ditches and irrigation techniques like the Mormon pioneers used. Has that nothing like that been found?
There is some evidence of irrigation with the Fremont. The Anasazi to the south, though, had really elaborate irrigation systems. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah, I just find it fascinating because I think we look at our society today and especially our obesity rates and our rates of diabetes and heart disease, and I think we're learning quickly we cannot continue to eat primarily carbohydrates and maintain good health. And I think that ancient people learned this lesson probably too. And I don't know. We look at our modern society and we think we have to have primarily grain-based diets, but that doesn't go along with any of the ancestors of our past. I mean, did any of the Native American people have primarily grain-based diets?
Just the Fremont. In the Great Basin proper to the west, people did rely more heavily on plant foods and small seeds from grasses, and especially pinion nuts. That was more important than what we see in the eastern Great Basin during the Fremont era. There is evidence that further to the west, on the eastern slopes of the Sierra Nevada, especially in Owens Valley, people had gotten into irrigating wild crops of various kinds. And part of the reason that people turn to those kinds of resources is because other resources, which may have a little higher efficiency rating, if you will, that is, with the same effort, you could get more calories. A lot of those higher ranked, as we say, resources were less available, perhaps as populations grew. This gets pretty dicey, these kinds of discussions. But many have argued that as farming societies grew, one of the developments that occurred was, as I mentioned, ceramics. And using pottery, they could cook corn and make a gruel, which then could be used to feed children rather than continuing to nurse them. And as individuals, especially women, no longer nursed their babies, they were more available to have more babies. As a consequence, farming societies tended to be more populous than hunting-gathering societies, which tended to be more nomadic and on the move, and were generally less populous. They needed more of a region to exploit than farmers who were able to raise crops in the same spot. So you get this shift between sort of nomadic, semi-nomadic to sedentary. And when you get sedentary, then populations tend to grow. But a lot of other things happen that are negative, such as I mentioned, business with health tends to decline. You get diseases, if they occur, they can spread easily. You also get infestations of various kinds of pests, mice, etc. And oftentimes when that happened, then people would move villages to get away from that infestation. At least these are things that we think were going on. There is evidence for them as well.
Well, great.
Hard to cover in 20 minutes, though.
So we're close to running out of time on how long we wanted to make this, but I wanted to have you mention something you said to me that really changed the game in paleontology, which was the laws that were changed, I believe you said in the late 60s and early 70s, related to how antiquity sites are handled. Can you talk a little bit about those changes in the laws and how that's impacted how we actually study paleontology and the discoveries that have come out of those law changes?
Okay, Richard, the one thing we're going to learn in this interview is the difference between paleontology and archaeology.
Or I'm sorry,
Okay. So
archaeology. Yeah, I like to
better get
think that the
give you a
humans
bad
and the
time.
dinosaurs were living together, but that wasn't actually
Okay,
the case. So yeah, you're
that's a
right.
great question. It's a great question that you just asked, and we're talking about really three big major laws that were enacted. One in 1966, and that's the National Historic Preservation Act, which required that significant cultural sites be evaluated. A particular section there called Section 106, that's really important. Then in 1970, I believe it was, NEPA, National Environmental Protection Act, was passed, which also said we needed to pay attention to the environment, including the cultural environment. And then in 71, 72, President Nixon signed Executive Order 11593, which said that all federal lands had to have their cultural resources evaluated to see if they are potentially be listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which was something that was set up with NHPA in 1966. Because of those laws, the opportunities for archaeologists to make a living and have a job in archaeology, those opportunities exploded because now all federal agencies that manage lands had to have an archaeologist on staff to do this evaluation of the cultural resources on their property. So anything BLM, Forest Service, the Department of Defense, all those federal agencies had to have archaeologists to do what the laws required. And shortly thereafter, states followed suit. In 1972, we have the first state archaeologist in the state of Utah. David Madsen was the first archaeologist, and we have the first antiquities laws being passed in the state of Utah. So those are very important. And because of the passage of those laws, we have some finds that would not have occurred without them, because archaeologists were forced to look in places that they had not looked before. And I gave you the example of one of those sites, which was discovered during the construction of I-70 between Salina, I believe it was south of Richfield, the Elsinore burial, where a burial was found 2 meters underground in a bell-shaped pit, which had been buried by alluvium washing off the slopes of the mountains. And in that burial, there was corn dated to shortly after the time of Christ. In addition, to the west, as I-70 was extended to the west to meet up with I-15, some very important sites were found, especially one called Five Finger Ridge, which never would have been found without these laws being passed. And that was the basis really for Fremont Indian State Park. So yeah, these laws are really important. There are many other implications of those laws. The other more recent one that has been passed in 1970 is called Nagpra, which I mentioned earlier, at least in our conversation, Native American Repatriation Act, which requires that we consult with Native peoples as we study their history in various ways. That's been a very important development.
And so basically what it is I go digging in my backyard, in my garden, and I'll find interesting little pieces of pottery, and I'm looking at it, and I don't know what it is. But if anybody happens to stumble upon a burial site and human remains, it's now a law that you have to stop digging, let the proper authorities know, and then it becomes an official archaeology site where you can come in and study it. That's basically to sum it up, correct?
Yes, whenever public funds are involved, then these laws kick in, whether they be federal lands or federal monies or state lands and state monies. So we have federal laws and you have state laws. However, that does not apply to private lands. So in your backyard, if you find pottery, etc., that's your
And
business.
that even goes for human remains. Well, I suppose depending on how
But
old they are.
only on private land, if you find human remains, then that's different.
Mm-hmm.
You have to contact the authorities, whether it be the sheriff, the state medical examiner, or the state archaeologist. but they have to evaluate the human remains and determine whether they are pre-European or not, and then various procedures click in. So if you find an archaeological site on private land, those laws don't apply. But if you find a human burial on private land, then there is a law that applies. So,
okay. One last topic. So a few years back, they had federal authorities had a raid. They ended up putting into federal prison a lot of men who were collecting antiquities. I think it was, well, obviously they were Native American antiquities. I think it was also some dinosaur bones. That's where we do get into paleontology.
that's right.
But it was basically they were trading them illegally on the black market. They got busted, and a lot of people went to prison for a long period of time. Do you think that is as far as the federal government should be going in terms of protecting these sites, locking people up in federal prison?
Well, they're breaking the law. Yeah, I don't know which example you're talking about, but if individuals are looting archaeological sites on federal lands or state lands, they are violating either federal or state law. So they're subject to that law. Whether it's a felony or a misdemeanor remains to be seen. Depends on how serious their looting was and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I don't remember all the specific details of the cases, but it was really controversial because a lot of the men who were locked up were like, white collar. They were, some of them were well recognized in the community, and it was just I know.
Let me kind of explain something there, Richard. This has been difficult because in the 1950s, I would say, and 60s, the Bureau of Land Management would actually publish recreational maps, and on those maps were located good arrowhead hunting places. Okay, so it's kind of confusing that at one moment it's okay to go out and pick up Native American artifacts, and then after these laws are passed, it's a felony. So it's been a difficult thing to become accustomed to. When I worked in the state of Utah, I worked with a number of collectors. It's one of the reasons we started the Utah State Archaeological Society, or at least reinvigorated it. That's something that Jesse B. Jennings started in his tenure at the University of Utah. But many of these individuals were fascinated by pre-European history. And the one outlet they had was to go search out artifacts and look at them and say, gee, this is fascinating. So what we tried to do is work with those individuals and give them a legitimate or legal outlet for their interest. And that is to work with archaeologists in various ways, either actually during excavations, and I carried out many excavations in Utah Valley with the help of volunteers, members of the USES group.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't add those collections to their, cigar boxes in their garage. Mm-hmm. Those collections all came to the university museums where they could be studied in the future by anybody who wanted to look at them in a different way or even in a similar way. So it is kind of a difficult transition for people to go from where arrowhead hunting was a fun thing to do, or Boy Scouts went out and dug in archaeological sites back in the day. But nonetheless, those laws have been in place now for a long time. Yeah. The Archaeological Resource Protection Act was passed in the 1970s. I mean, that's 50 years ago.
Yeah. So if you see an arrowhead on the ground, you shouldn't pick it up if you're on federal land?
Depends if you're on public land or private land.
Yeah, if you're on public land, you shouldn't be picking it up.
You shouldn't be picking it up. There were some exceptions made in the Antiquities laws called the Boy Scout Clause, which said if a boy or a man picked up an arrowhead, that's not a big deal. But where do you draw the line?
Yeah.
I should really say that the first law that had to do with antiquities in the United States was the Antiquities Act of 1906, but it was not very specific, and it's very hard to this developed because of the fact that people were coming over from Europe and digging in sites, especially in southwestern Colorado, Mesa Verde area, and taking those collections back to Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So it was thought we need to stop this because they're depleting our cultural heritage and the heritage of Native peoples. But the more recent laws that I have mentioned, have really put some teeth into the Antiquities Act.
Yeah.
So they all know, the public lands are not to be exploited in that way.
Yeah. Well, you've done a lot of stories about guys who like to go dig for buried treasures and these people who use primarily metal detectors. But we did a story about a guy who went out in the middle of nowhere and took this giant metal rod and put it down into the ground. And he found that was an amazing technique for like finding buried pottery. And we wrote the story and, without any other side to it. Then we were contacted by a man from, I believe he was from the Forest Service, and just said that is a sure method to totally destroy an antiquity site. I want you to publish a retraction and tell people don't go around into burial sites or places that could be antiquity sites with a metal prod and be putting it down into the ground. Is that also your take on that, on doing that practice?
Absolutely. It's the same method as you use to take pollen cores, although pollen core pipes are bigger around. We actually use those kinds of coring techniques to look at sediments, but not to probe for pottery, which that's something that was done a lot down in South America. And they would, of course, when you poke it down, you may in fact be going right through a complete ceramic vessel and destroying it, or might right through somebody's skull. So absolutely not. That should not be done, especially on public land.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's been great having you, Professor Janetski. I just find this so fascinating, and I know there's a whole nother area we could be getting into outside of Utah, the Indians that live in the Great Plains, but maybe we'll have you on again after your book comes out. It sounds like a great book. It sounds like a fascinating read. And where can listeners or readers get more information about your book, and how can they buy it when it comes out?
It will be available at the University of Utah Press. In fact, a number of books that I have written and others have written with me are available through the University of Utah Press. They are part of the occasional paper series at Brigham Young University at the Museum of Peoples and Cultures there. You can also buy them if you go to the museum in Provo. Those books are available there as well. The Promontory book that I'm writing with a number of authors, as well as my colleague Jack Ives from the University of Alberta up in Edmonton, that will be available, I hope, within six to 8 months.
And right now, people could still buy your, I believe it's the Native Americans of Yellowstone. I saw that on Amazon. Is that correct?
Yeah, you can buy that in Yellowstone National Park. But also at the University of Utah Press, they published that book.
Or I would recommend everybody go to Ken Sanders' Rare Books if you want to support local businesses. That's the best way to go.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
All right.
And when you go to Fremont Indian State Park, we have a number of publications there on the work that we did prior to the completion of the highway through there.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and that's a really neat area. It's so underpopulated in northern Utah near Promontory, and I met some cattle or some sheep ranchers up there years ago, and it's a beautiful place. If people want to go up there, I don't suppose they can actually see the sites. I guess there is a Fremont Indian Museum now. Where is that museum located again?
It's in Clear Creek Canyon, south of Richfield. If you go between Richfield and I-70, you go right past Fremont Indian State Park.
All right. Okay, well, thanks so much for being on the show, Professor Janatsky. I really appreciate it.
Good, you're welcome. Thanks for asking me.
The Utah Stories Hidden Utah podcast is brought to you by Green Bike in Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City's nonprofit bike share connects employment and residential centers to transit stops and popular entertainment destinations. Green Bike seeks to improve community health, air quality, and increase the use of existing transit infrastructure. Green Bike is a local nonprofit, public-private partnership between Salt Lake City, the Utah Transit Authority, Select Health, and other private sponsors. To date, Green Bikers have removed 5.8 million vehicle miles from local roads, prevented more than 5 million pounds of CO2 from entering our air, all while burning 76 million calories in the process. That's 267,000 slices of pizza. To learn more about Green Bike, find out how you can take as many rides as you want for less than 20 cents a day. Follow Green Bike on social media at SLC Bike Share or visit greenbikeslc.org. The Utah Story Show is also brought to you by Canyon Meadows Grass-Fed Beef. If you have not tried Canyon Meadows Grass-Fed Beef, you absolutely need to try a couple of their steaks or a brisket or a roast or a rack of ribs. They are absolutely incredible, especially if you love smoking or barbecuing. I just don't know how you could go back to smoking regular beef when Canyon Meadows is so much better. So I basically do these barbecues on my big smoker, and I show the process of how I smoke cherry wood. It takes all day, 12 hours. I smoke this brisket, and it is like fall off the bone, super, super tender. It's amazing. Canyon Meadows, the flavor, the nutrition, the way it's produced, everything about it is so far superior. Go check them out. They've got a special offer going on for Utah Stories podcast listeners. You'll use offer code Utah Stories, and their website address is cmrbeef.com. Go check them out right now. You will not regret it. Thank you so much for watching the Utah Stories program. I'm glad you joined us. If you would like to be a bigger part of the Utah Stories program and get a newsletter every week, go visit utahstories.com and subscribe to our newsletter. It's really the very best way you can connect with us, and we can send you our best content every single week. We are always looking deeper and diving into stories that fascinate us more. And it's a great way to connect with your community, find out about local businesses, find out what's happening in the local scene in Utah. Again, that's utahstories.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter. We are on all the podcatchers. I would actually encourage you to subscribe to us through one of the podcatchers and listen to all of our back episodes that way while you're doing something else. And that way you can, be doing something else, and rather than occupying both your ears and your eyes, just occupy your ears and listen to us that way. It's a great way to go about it. All right. Thanks again for joining us. I'll see you next time.